Everyone makes mistakes. I made a really big one with my sheep painting recently. All I had to do is touch up some areas of my painting, but I overdid it. From a peaceful looking sky, all of a sudden it became doom and gloom. But in the process, I mixed a lot of colors and I wanted to take a big break from it. So what do? I start a new painting with those colors that I just mixed in abundance. And the goal was to strive for simplicity and do it in one day. Plus to feature a sky that has a sunset, and maybe I could learn something to fix my painting in the near future. From the beginning, I wanted to attempt this painting in a completely different manner. Normally I start with a tinted background, but I went straight to painting on the white canvas. I laid out bodies of color for the sky and also the clouds, but I also made an impression of the landscape. The goal was not to be accurate, but to capture the impression of the setting sun on the landscape. I knew from the start that the nice glow of the warm sun will make or break my painting. Therefore, the main goal was to capture the light that was emitted by the sun. I used a combination of titanium white, cadmium yellow, and also cadmium red to paint the sun. I did a lot of dry brushing to smooth it out and make it a soft transition from a pale yellow in the center to a peachy pink on the outside. I had to paint carefully also because nearby the sun there was also some dark bodies of color. One wrong move and the brightness would have been dulled. At the bottom here, before I even start the landscape, I'm beginning to paint some clouds that almost appear to be mountains at first, but because they are soft, they are really clouds. There's also an interesting fade at the bottom. I used cerulean blue mixed with white, of course, and in ways this is the only area I used that color. There's also a lot of little clouds that are in a way kind of stringy that swirl around, and other clouds that seem to have broken apart from the bigger ones. Again, I didn't follow the photo 100%. I planted them kinda in a way where they should be, but my goal was not really accuracy. It was just to get the impression of the sky from the photo. In case you were wondering, there's more to this painting than just the sky. There's also a tree. I began setting the branches of where the tree is going to be in the picture plane, and then I started to build some of the leaves so I know the border between the tree and the sky as I paint the rest of the painting. Instead of using black, I used alizarin crimson and viridian, more so on the alizarin crimson side, to give it a more nice violet tone that goes with the rest of the painting. In some sections, I painted leaf for leaf, branch for branch, but in others, I just blotted out big bodies of color to give the impression of a lot of leaves or branches. Again, I didn't follow the photo 100%. I just wanted the impression of a tree. I suppose besides the main tree that's the closest to the viewing plane, there's also some more trees or bushes a little more into the distance, and this was probably the hardest part to paint in the entire painting because of how close the borderline of the clouds were to the trees or bushes that were below in the landscape. Because the goal was to do this painting in one day, the paint has never dried. The paint was wet and it was actually helpful, making a nice blur where it helped recede those bushes or trees more into the background, but I painted very carefully at the same time. In a way, I was trying to find the perfect balance of detail and also a sense of depth. The land was not exactly flat, and there was lots of bumps throughout. It was a rough terrain, so I started to lay down the groundwork of the lights and darks. Believe it or not, this color I'm using is quite expensive in terms of the colors I chose, which is alizarin crimson, viridian, and also cobalt green. In different variations, cobalt green is a great alternative, in my opinion, to lighten a dark and give it a green tone versus using white. And it's becoming slowly one of my favorite colors to use, even though I use it very sparingly. Besides building on the roughness of the terrain, I also started to build some more bushes and some of the low-hanging branches of the main tree. Besides those little details, I'm also trying to recreate the curvature of the landscape. The setting is definitely a hill, and I wanted to capture the way it flows in the picture I took, with all the grass and bumps of the rough terrain. Just because the picture is very dark, that doesn't mean it lacks color. So here I'm applying some light greens into the tree and reworking some of the branches that stand out. I'm not going into a lot of detail, but I wanted to create the illusion of the tree having branches and individual leaves, even if it was impressionistic. Here I'm beginning to work on the grass. After painting grass on my previous complex painting, this was rather easy. Again, I'm using cobalt green with a little bit of cadmium yellow and a little bit of white, of course, to create some of the highlights of the grass. I'm only laying out the color here. I will later go back and blur it. Since the grass is in darkness, it should have a softer touch and not be sharp unless it's closer to the viewing plane. And besides grass, there's also some flowers, which I don't recall what kind they are, but they are very bright, even in the darkness. Again, cadmium yellow, but this time with less cobalt green, to give the impression that they are bright despite the lack of light from a setting sun. As I'm getting closer to the foreground, I'm adding more contrast into the grass by adding more darks. Again, I'm using alizarin crimson with viridian, but also cobalt green to get that look, which in a way is kind of like a camouflage green. And while the paint is still wet, I'm applying lines and brush strokes to give the impression of more grass blades in various directions and sizes, nitpicking particular ones that I liked in the photo, but for the most part, all created from experience of doing grass in previous paintings. You notice here, I was trying to hide my signature, but in the end I blurred it out because I didn't like how it looked. I will hide it later discreetly when I'm not filming, unfortunately. See if you can spot it out when I post the painting on Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. I began repainting the sky, and the first step was to mix a color that I was going to use consistently. For the most part, the bulk of the sky was a nice, beautiful lavender. In order to capture that color, I used cobalt blue with a very small hint of alizarin crimson. And depending on the location, I used more or less white, and in some scenarios, more or less blue or alizarin crimson. If you thought I was finished with the grass, you were wrong. There were more intricate grass blades and some weeds as well. Plus, more flowers, a lot more flowers. I started to build more of them, and in different variations as well. In some ways, I planted the flower heads first and then drew some stems afterwards. And here and there I will apply more highlights for the grass. But the goal is to create more sharpness and more contrast as I get closer and closer to the foreground. That way I create a better illusion of depth and distance on a small 2D surface. Even though this painting is more impressionistic, I'm still using illusionistic techniques. Also, I went back into the trees or bushes in the back. They seem to be lacking some detail, so I applied some light greens and more darks to give the impression of individual leaves and branches, even though they receded into the clouds. Same thing with the bushes in the foreground. I added more leaves, variations of twigs and branches, as well as some tall grass. The goal was to establish a nice separation of the background and the foreground, pretty much the middle ground, to further enhance the sense of depth and distance. Since the paint was still wet, I carefully painted between the branches and leaves to match the color of the sky a little more where the tree was. But I took advantage of this by making the leaves a little more blurry by dry brushing the border of the tree leaves with the sky. Also, to give the tree more variations of green, I added my new favorite color, cobalt green, into the mix, especially for the lighter dark tones. Plus some variations of my Viridian and alizarin crimson, where I have more Viridian in the mix for some of the darker leaves. Same thing with the clouds. Since they were still wet, I dry brushed the edges and kind of like twirled around the brush a little bit to soften the edges and also to give them a string-like appearance as they dissolved into the sky. And to furthermore enhance the radiance of the sun, I dry brushed the transition a little more. Again, all very carefully painting around the clouds, and to be careful not to dull out the sunlight. And last but not least, I applied some dark blue to enhance the color of the clouds. And this is where I stopped filming because I needed to be very close to the painting and pay attention to the little details that are easy to miss. But rest assured, there was a lot of dry brushing and twirling around the paint to get the string-like appearance of the clouds as they blended with the rest of the skyline as the sun set on the earth. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly do appreciate it. And in case you want to see the reference photo, here it is. Also, if you want to see the finished picture, it will be posted on my Instagram. Not your typical painter, of course. Just remember, it's okay to make mistakes, especially if you learn from them, no matter if they're big or small. That is the only way you will learn in the end, by taking a risk. It's only truly failure if you don't try again. And also, sorry for the long delay on my sheep painting, but I promise I will fix the sky. I have some ideas, but I'm still thinking about them. In the meantime, I'm going to start another painting, this time a small acrylic, and it will feature a sky as well. Once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob. I'm not your typical painter. Stay tuned for more. Bye.